CHAUCER'S English. I am going to look in detail at Grocery's English. I am going to look at the ways in which he develops out of the matrix of regional dialect English, French, and Latin, and the history of the languages he experienced and highly developed out of the matrix, a supple poetic form, vocabulary, and idiom. But I also want to look at the ways in which Chaucer's language reflect the culture and experience of its time. And so, before I'm looking detail at his pronunciation and his vocabulary, syntax and grammar, and then this attitude toward language, I want to look a little bit at his life and times. Chaucer was born probably about the year 1340, and he very soon entered aristocratic service, rising very high in, if you like, the circles of court and the city of London. Eventually, he became a member of the clerk of the King's Works. His job in the 1380s and 90s is staging great events and spectacles for the court of the King Richard II. He served in Parliament, he worked in the economic life of England, and when he lived in his apartment overlooking the streets of London, he could see the cameras on the culture of his time, recorded most memorably as many of the smell in the prologue portraits of Canterbury Tales. When we talk about Chaucer's English, we are therefore talking about the language of an educated public servant. In late 14th century London, someone who probably had been schooled in Latin, someone whose court and courtier experience would have been in French, and someone whose political and cultural life looking outside of England, we know that Chaucer made some diplomatic forays into Italy in the 1370 days, where he may have met the great Italian poet Petrarch and Boccaccio. Many of his Canterbury Tales and other poems draw on Giovanni Boccaccio works as their resources. Chaucer was aware of Petrarch as the great poet laureate of 14th century Italy. He was traveled and he was aware of Italian literary and political culture. So, what we have in Chaucer is a metropolitan and the cosmopolitan poet. Now, let me just pause and say that any triangle word, there were some writers who really did write on all four languages. Chaucer's friend and contemporary, and indeed a lawyer, was a poet named John Gower. And John Gower wrote three major poems. He wrote a poem called the Pax Clematis, Cry in Voice, and they wrote it in Latin. He wrote a poem called the Confessio, Amantis, the Lover's Confession, and a Robot in English. And they wrote a poem called the Nail Wall Girl, the Mirror of Man, and he wrote it in French. Gower may be unique in his linguistic facility, but it is not unique in representing this trilingual literary culture for the 14th century England. So, when we look at Chaucer, we're looking at an individual who knows other languages and culture, is synthesized in vocabulary, syntax, form, and idiom, and who is bringing together into unique lyrics expression the metropolitan and cosmopolitan life of his time. Now, when we look at Chaucer, we're going to look into dialect, and I'm going to say a little bit about Chaucer regional dialect in this. Like you, but I'm going to save from my next launcher an extended discussion of Middle English dialect and their literary representation. So, for now, let's look in detail at all language of Chaucer's poetry, pronunciation, vocabulary, syntax, and grammar attitudes toward language and toward language change. Let's begin with pronunciation. Chaucer English is a dialect of Middle English made up of elements drawn from the East Midland dialect to help form what would become a London standard. The statement means something like the following: that Chaucer's vowel system would have been very much like the Southern Old English vowel system and very similar to the vowels of a modern spoken European language. A, E, I, O, U or A, E, I, O, U. So we say not name, but nam. We say not meat, but meat. We say not bite, but beat. We say not house, but whose. We say not do, but though. We say not so, but so. And here in these vowels, you can hear the sounds of the old Chaucerian Middle English vowel system. Consonants would have been different from the cluster continent of Old English. We'll remember from a previous lecture how I talked about the classic of characteristic consonant cluster of Old English. Word disappearing, clo become low, clue loud, ring become ring, what become what, and so on. So, Chaucer's consonant system is simpler, if you like, than the Old English system, but there are no so-called silent letters. Final E is always pronounced. So, for example, a word like knight, the one riding on a horse, is connect marriage, would have been pronounced marriage. Chaucer's vocabulary deploys for the first time a whole range of new words from French and Latin. He relies on the learning vocabulary of the university, of the courts of the guilds, and of the literary tradition. But Chaucer is always aware of the native their Old English resources of his language. And what I hope to illustrate in this lecture is in particular the ways in which he will juxtapose a new important word from French or Latin with an old native or Anglo-Saxon word that's still in the language. He will create striking literary effects. Let's talk about syntax and grammar. Now, because Chaucer was writing poetry for the most part, he just produced several major works of prose. But it is poetry, is where the water is wept, often influenced by the nature of poetry, that he is writing iambic poetry. Poetry with a rhythm, poetry that scans and rhymes. And remember, unlike Old English, poetry that liberated Chaucer does not write alliterative verse, although we may occasionally use alliteration for special effects. So the rhythm of his iambic pentameter that is at his 5-beat, 10-syllable lines in the Canterbury Tales, and then needs to have them rhymes in couplets. These constraints occasionally influence his word, but it is fair to say that his word order patterns are, if you like, standing midway between those of the old inflected patterns forms of English and what we see today is the full uninflected patterns of modern English. Let me call attention to a few features of Chaucerian word order. Chaucer uses the standard subject, verb, object. I give the ball. This is by Chaucer's time and standard word order pattern for a declarative sentence. You ask a question in Middle English not by using the word do at the beginning of sentence. This feature does not emerge until the mid-16th century and it will be the subject of later lecture. But rather you ask the question by inverting the order of the subject and the verb. You gave the ball. Gave you the ball? That's how you ask a question. Similarly, you can reverse the work letter for a command or inclines of negation or for stress. So for example, gave you the ball. Gave you the ball? I gave the ball. I the ball gave. These are grammatical utterances is Chaucer's Middle English and the switching now, not of the subject and the verb of the verb and the object, indicates level of stress or levels of emphasis. It is important to note that negation in Old Middle and Early Modern English is cumulative now, part of the legacy of 17th and 18th century grammarians and pedagogues, and pens is that double negative cancel themselves out. This is largely pedagogical invention, and it was to make English look logical the idea that two negative made positive word, but for a great deal of time, the history of English, negative or negation was cumulative, that is, the more negatives you use, the stronger it could be, they reinforce each other. You can have double negatives, you can have triple negatives, you can have, as in this line from the Canterbury Tales, the general prologue, the description of the knight. You can have a striking quadruple negative. He never yet Neveline ne said unto no matter white. A message on no manner, that is, he never yet in no way said anything bad, know how to nobody. This kind of quadruple negative is a picture of the language, and so, in this course of reading Chaucer in the book King of Middle English, we need to recognize that the Rosary focus enough on the grammatical, but certain forms are actually grammatical, and that is the registration of our grammar that has changed. Pronouns are very important in Chaucer's Middle English, in Old English, in Middle English, and even in our early modern English up to the time Shakespeare. You had, as you have in many modern European languages, two sets of pronouns. You had a second person singular and informal noun, a nominative, the date of accusative, diode and gene. If that is when you wanted to address a single individual, or when you were speaking intimately to someone who is familiar, when you were speaking down to someone you down, this is like in French, tu to fight them, or in German using du was, Spanish using tu, or an Italian using tu. Now, if you wanted to address a group of people, or if you want to speak formally to someone, you will use the pronoun you, and so, ye, you, and your correspond to thee, thou, thy, and thine. And this distinction becomes one of class and not simply number now. Let me just say something of the following. We think of thee and thou as formal, and this will be an interesting issue later on the course. Let me just anticipate by saying thee and thou are not originally the formal forms, they are rather the informal forms. You and your are formal forms like thou in French, sie in German, use in Spanish, lay in Italian. And so you have a double system of the second person pronoun operating into start with Chaucer, used for very special literary and cultural effects. So I given you some of the highlights of the pronunciation of the grammar, of the morphology and syntax of Chaucer language. And now, what I would like to do is read to you in Middle English the operating sentence of General Prologue, the Canterbury Tales, perhaps one of the most famous sentences in all English literature, and I like to share you how Chaucer makes meaning out of the linguistic resources of his time and place. I'm going to read it in Middle English, and then I'm going to give you a modern English translation. One that April, with his shoulders after the row of mass at Harrison Totoroto, and debuttered everything and switched the core of what you have to own changed, is the flow of Zephyrus, with his way to breath, in spirit, hap in every whole time of the condo, causes, and the youngest son cousin, the ram is held coarse, the smaller, fullest smack and melodia that's left, and I'll finish with open is so pretty. I'm not here caution long gun talk to go children's ages and Palmas 42 seconds strongest Jeffernaut house, cause in central London, especially from every sheerest end of England, the country list for holy blissful martyr for Hamilton and that day forsaken. When it happens that April, with his sweet showers, aspires the drought of March to the root and days every day, and not fluid, from whose power the flowers giving birth when, Zephyr also with his sweet breath, as inspired the tender crops and ever would rather the young sun, has run a half of discourse to the sign of the ram, and a little birds make melodies who sleep all the night with a eyes open, so nature stimulates them in their hearts, and then people desire to go on pilgrimage, and professional pilgrims to see strange shores, and they went their way, specially from the end of every country in England to Canterbury. in order to seek the holy blissful martyr would help them when they are sick. This is one sentence and 18 lines long. Let's think about the sentence first as a piece of literature, and perhaps it is easiest to think about a little anachronistic late if you're coming to Chaucer for the first time. Let's think about it cinematically. The camera on the poet and I bends down from the interior to the surface of the earth, and we move from the sky, from the zodiac, the sign of the ram, the winds of the west wind, then down with the rain to the treetops with the birds are singing to the land itself. And then in a kind of parallel focus will we move like the spokes of a wheel towards the hub. From the periphery, from every sheerest end, and from the end of every country of England to that focal point of Canterbury. This double movement of focus is, if you like, the projection of the passage, and Chaucer language give us the vocabulary for understanding that kind of focus. Let's look at the words now. This is an opening of poem that juxtaposes new words of French and Latin origin with words and forms of Old English or Anglo-Saxon origin: sweet, showers, drought, march, the root, piercing. Piercing is a French word, and bathing. Everything, French word in which is liquor. O-U-R-T-N. Very French word. And of course is going around the floor. Another French word. Now, what is the power? The power is virtue. Now we think of virtue in a distinctly feminine way, and that really is 18th century innovation, virtual rewarded. Virtue is a kind of form of chastity. But virtue comes from the Latin word vir, V-I-R, meaning man, and so its manliness, its power. It is a form of control, and what is manly power? Do its engenders. There's a gender equality. Now the rebirth. This isn't just the birds and the bees, but it is the power of regeneration in spring. You have the west wind. What does it mean? So-called the west wind zephyr. It means to invoke a world, a classical mythology. Zephyr is the Greek god of the west wind. And what does Zephyr do? With his breath, he inspires. As far as I can tell, inspire used as a verb in this way appear from the first time in the passage in English poetry that Zephyr breathing into now. To inspire is to breath, into respire, Latin to breath. To respire is a breath again and again. To expire is to stop breathing. To perspire is to breathe through. Now, where is he inspiring every halt and heat? The tender crops and the young sun has run into cars to the sign of the ram. So, what Chaucer is doing is he juxtaposing here the sign of the ram, not the race, with the mythology of Zephyr. In addition to this, French words, Chaucer uses English words. Now, I am calling the attention primarily to the new and imported terms here, words like virtue. In gender, inspired the name of the great god Zephyr, but it is important to see this opposed to English term Zephyr has a sweet breath, English words. He inspires, French word, but he inspires into health and heat, not just English landscape, but an alliterative praising health and heat. The ram runs through has its course. Now, that is ultimately a Latin and a French word, and this is small of fullest. These little birds are doing what they're making melodia, ultimately a Latin term for music. Why they are making music? Because they're sleeping with their eyes open. That is they're not sleeping, they're having bird sex. And yet, the birds are having bird sex in French. In terms of music in Chaucer's world, as in around the language of sex, is the language of French, because nature has put them in their courages, not in their heart but in their core, the courageous. In Old English, if you have a lot of heart, you are hearty in French. If you have a lot of core, you were courageous. And so, courage means not just courage, it literally means heart. And so imagine Geoffrey Chaucer walking out into a world that has so changed that even the birds are singing in French. Then people long to go on pilgrimage, this technically term from French, then it must run to courageous. And we move through this opening sentence in this juxtaposition here of the English and the French. To summarize the words for high culture concepts, the words for intellection, for asexuality, for courtliness, for poetry, for culture, and the imagination of French. The words in a landscape are English, halt, heath, breadth, sun, ram. So if you like a narrative of French playing itself again into the English landscape, would it be going too far to say at the opening of the Canterbury Tales, replace an imaginatively linguistic way the impositions of the Norman conquest as French speakers into an English landscape? Let's look at the final complete of this passage. The holy blissful martyr 42nd that hem hath holpen on that day for sea. That is when they want to seek the holy blissful mother when they were sick. Holy Old English, blissful Old English martyr, French ultimately from Greek, but a French 42nd English. So when Thomas à Becket, who was the martyr in Canterbury, that they are going to see. When they are going to see Thomas à Becket shine, what an effective going to see is someone who had been martyr, that is the concept word marker, enters into this linguistic landscape as an imported word. That's hem hath holpen that they forsake, that will help them when they are sick. I stress in reading that this is really an evocatively and alliteratively line hem hath holpen, help, help. That's a weak verb. Now, you remember strong verbs and weak verbs? Well, in the Old English, help, help, holpen, help was a strong verb. It's changing in Chaucer's time. Chaucer can use the strong form, but it's a little bit arcussim. In the other words, there are evocation at the end of this great sentence that Chaucer is having the forms of English reasserts themselves that hem hath holpen on that day for sea. Seek and seek. One word means seek, the other means seek. This is the technical term rhyme rich, that is when two rhyme on the same word, that means two different things. So there's a sense of profound closure at the end of the first sentence, Canterbury Tales, that is signal not the true vocabulary but to some. And in my reading, what I tried to stress was the alliteration at the end forces the reader to slow down. It is the breath of the speaker that's mirroring, if you like, the breath of Zephyr. And this is, therefore, not simply an opening description, but an act of inspiration. Inspire me on muse. This is what the classical poet always asks at the beginning, and if Zephyrus is breathing new life into the landscape, then the classical inheritance is breathing new life into English poetry. We are now a world, not a hardness, but a courageous, where Zephyr inspires us all. What I am to suggest in this Chaucer has done in the opening of Canterbury Tales, as he has written, if you like, in a nutshell. This history of English language to this point, as I have sought to praise it, that you see French and English words jockeying for position. In the line that you see the shards of alliterative poetry packing themselves through And you see, and if you like evocation of a larger classical way of thinking, this is a way of going back to the ancients that Chaucer is using here to show us the momentousness, the portent, if you like, of the opening of the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's world is trilingual. Chaucer is writing in English, yet he is bringing the vocabulary from older languages together into a profound synthesis of landscape and culture. Chaucer will also bring together the dialect of English, and then my subsequent lecture, I am going to talk primarily about Middle English, regional dialect, and what the study of dialects can do as for in understanding not just Chaucer but earlier English literary culture. But what I want to stress is that Chaucer is the great synthesizer that not only just agreed back into the past of English, but it reaches across from every series and from the end of the border of every country to embrace the entire dialectical richness of the English language as he heard and read it at the end of the 14th century. Thank you.